There's a plant that grows on 6 continents and has 5 times more magnesium than spinach, more than many capsules, and more than most fortified cereals on the market. It produces about 70,000 seeds per plant, and those seeds can stay alive in the soil for 40 years. Remains of this plant have even been found in the stomachs of ancient bog bodies. And yet, in much of the West, it was classified as a weed. The supplement industry moves almost $7 billion a year, selling magnesium in pills. Meanwhile, this plant pops up on its own in sidewalk cracks, gardens, tilled ground, and roadsides. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a plant more nutritious than many supermarket vegetables ended up on industrial agriculture's blacklist, and why you might have been overlooking one of the most powerful sources of magnesium out there. In a traditional northern Indian kitchen during winter, many families cook dark green leaves covered in a natural whitish powder to make curries and parathas. It's not spinach, it's not kale, it's batua. Over 300 million people in South Asia eat it every week. On the slopes of the Himalayas in Nepal, they call it betu and consider it an essential part of their winter diet. In Turkey, it's been harvested for generations. In rural areas of Mexico, many traditional cooks recognize it as quilite and add it to tamales, broths, and stews. Here's the first clue that something went wrong. In the West, you know spinach, kale, arugula, chard. They're in every supermarket. But this plant, eaten by millions of people in different regions of the world, barely exists in Western consciousness. Most haven't even heard one of its names. The problem started with fragmentation. In India, it has one name. In Nepal, another. In Turkey, another. In Mexico, another. In botany, yet another. Chenopodium album. Too many names for a single plant. And when a plant doesn't have a clear identity, it also doesn't get a stable presence in cookbooks, databases, agricultural campaigns, or research proposals. It wasn't a planned conspiracy, but the result was the same: cultural disappearance. Think of cilantro and coriander. In many places, it was understood that they were different parts of the same plant. That clarity allowed it to enter everyday cooking in the market. This plant never received the same treatment. It was always seen as something foreign, something local, something without prestige, something easy to ignore. However, the real story is very different. This plant fed people for thousands of years. In some places, it was everyday food. In others, it was labeled an undesirable weed. The same leaves a grandmother cooks for her family are what an industrial farmer tries to eliminate with herbicides. At what point did growing on its own become a plant crime? To understand this, we need to go back not decades or centuries, but millennia. In 1950, Danish peat cutters near the village of Tallinn found a body so well preserved that they thought it was a recent victim. They called the police, but the man had died over 2,400 years prior. Today, he's known as the Tallinn Man. His face was so intact he looked like he was sleeping, but the most revealing part wasn't his face, but his stomach. Decades later, researchers at the National Museum of Denmark conducted a meticulous analysis of his last meal. They found barley, flax, wild buckwheat, and other seeds. But one plant appeared in greater proportion than many of the others. The same plant we're talking about today. For him, it wasn't a weed, it was food. Food cultivated, harvested, and eaten with intent. And it wasn't an isolated case. Other bodies found in bogs across northern Europe showed similar patterns. The leaves and seeds of this plant were harvested and consumed over 3,000 years ago. That wasn't impromptu foraging. It was part of a food system. Europe wasn't the only place where its value was understood. About 8,000 kilometers to the west, indigenous peoples of North America independently developed a similar relationship with members of this same botanical family. About 5,000 years ago, they began selecting, cultivating, and storing them. Over time, they formed a complete agricultural complex in the river valleys stretching from what is now Missouri to Ohio. Archaeologists call it the Eastern Agricultural Complex. That system predates the arrival of corn from Mexico by almost 2,000 years. For millennia, different communities thrived thanks to crops that many today would call weeds. At archaeological sites like Russell Cave in Alabama, seeds from this family were found systematically stored and managed. It wasn't a minor resource, it was an important food, and there was something even more revealing. This domestication occurred separately in several regions of the American continent. The South American Andes, the Mesoamerican highlands, and the forests of eastern North America saw different civilizations come to a similar conclusion. This plant is worth it. It nourishes, it's resilient, it deserves to be cultivated. Here's an uncomfortable comparison. You've surely heard of quinoa, the famous Andean superfood, which today can cost over 310 Mexican pesos per kilo in health food stores. Quinoa belongs to the genus Chenopodium. Our plant does too. They are close relatives, and comparative studies have found something surprising. Chenopodium album can show superior nutritional and amino acid profiles to quinoa. In other words, the weed can outperform the superfood. In the United States, its most common name is lamb's quarters. In Spanish, it's sometimes related to cenizo, quilite, or goosefoot, depending on the region. But beyond the name, the important thing is this. It's probably one of the most nutritious plants most people never learn to recognize. Let's look at what modern analyses show. In a 100-gram portion of fresh leaves, this plant can provide about 96% of the daily requirement for vitamin C, 73% for vitamin A, 37% for riboflavin, 37% for manganese, and 31% for calcium, with just 43 calories. Compared to spinach, it contains approximately twice as much vitamin B1, twice as much vitamin B2, about 3 times more vitamin C, and about 3 times more calcium. Compared to kale, it can provide about 2.5 times more vitamin A. It also stands out for its protein, fiber, and mineral content, but the most striking fact is its magnesium. Research comparing wild edible species with common supermarket vegetables found that this plant can contain more than twice the potassium, almost 3 times the calcium, and up to 5 times more magnesium than commercial leaves like lettuce, spinach, or cabbage. 5 times more magnesium, not in a capsule, not in an expensive powder, but in a plant that grows on its own. And it's not just about how much it contains, but how much your body can actually use. Many leafy greens, including spinach, have high levels of oxalates. These compounds bind to minerals like calcium and magnesium, making them harder to absorb. In contrast, research on Chenopodium species suggests less interference compared to other vegetables. That means better bioavailability. More of what you eat actually reaches your cells. The supplement industry rarely explains this difference. It sells isolated compounds, magnesium oxide, magnesium citrate, magnesium glycinate. Each promises something different. Each is bought again and again, but the magnesium in a plant comes with fiber, enzymes, and other nutrients that work together. Your body recognizes food. It doesn't always respond the same way to a pill. Even so, nutrition alone doesn't explain why this plant disappeared from the center of the conversation. The real answer also has to do with economics and control. A single plant can produce an average of 70,000 seeds. Some exceed 100,000. Under ideal conditions, much higher figures have been documented. A single well-established patch can release millions of seeds per hectare, and you don't need to harvest them or re-sow them every season. The plant reproduces itself. Here's what transforms abundance into permanence. Those seeds can remain viable for decades. Different studies have found them to stay active in the soil for between 12 and 78 years. Even after being buried for 20 years, some of them can still germinate. In other words, someone could have let it grow decades ago, and you could still harvest descendants from that same population. Furthermore, it adapts to almost any condition. It germinates in light, medium, or heavy soils. It tolerates acidity or alkalinity. It withstands droughts, salinity, and poor soils. It can grow from cold regions to warm areas, from sea level to mountain valleys. It's not a fragile seedling that requires specific fertilizers. It's a plant that takes root, returns, and persists. And then an uncomfortable question arises. What happens to the seed business when a crop doesn't require you to buy again? The global seed industry generates over $60 billion a year. Many modern crops depend on repeated purchases, commercial hybrids, or varieties under industrial control. This plant breaks that logic. It reseeds itself. It cannot be easily locked into an annual cycle of purchase and dependency. From a commercial perspective, that's not attractive. It's inconvenient. The magnesium industry faces a similar problem. The global market for magnesium supplements reached billions of dollars and is projected to continue growing. That growth depends on one thing, that deficiency remains common and the numbers are alarming. A large portion of the adult population doesn't meet the recommended magnesium intake. That deficiency creates demand. Demand creates products. Products create a market, and here appears a plant that offers a lot of magnesium. It grows with almost no intervention, reproduces itself, and doesn't require constant purchases. It's not a profitable product, it's a solution, and free solutions rarely receive multi-million-dollar campaigns. That's why scientific literature repeats one word when talking about this species: neglected or underutilized. Not because it's of little value, but because almost no one with economic power gains anything by promoting it. You don't need to imagine secret meetings. The process is simpler. Research follows funding. Funding follows what's patentable, and what can't be controlled, sold, or standardized tends to fall out of sight. The weed label finished erasing its reputation. Agricultural services describe it as an aggressive competitor in row crops. Studies show yield losses in corn and soy when it appears among industrial monocultures. From the logic of the uniform field, that makes it an enemy. But that same ability to grow strongly, adapt, and regenerate is exactly what makes it valuable as food. What's a problem for industrial agriculture can be a blessing for human nutrition. History often repeats itself. For decades, white clover was part of lawn mixes because it helped fertilize the soil. Then, when the industry needed to sell herbicides on a large scale, clover began to be seen as a problem. Something similar happened with this plant. It became more profitable to fight it than to understand it. But the plant doesn't understand stock markets, patents, or board meetings. It only understands reproduction and survival. It keeps waiting in underground seed banks, in unsprayed gardens, in vacant lots, by roadsides, in corners where no one looks twice. Ignoring it has consequences that go beyond losing a free vegetable. Magnesium participates in over 300 enzymatic reactions in the body. It's involved in muscle function, nerve transmission, blood sugar regulation, blood pressure, protein synthesis, and energy production. When it's scarce, cramps, persistent fatigue, irritability, difficulty sleeping, migraines, palpitations, and a general feeling that something isn't working right can appear. The problem is that this deficiency often goes unnoticed. Common blood tests measure serum magnesium, but only a small part of the body's magnesium is in the blood. The rest is found in bones and tissues. It's possible to be unwell and for the test to seem normal. At the same time, modern agriculture has depleted many soils. Crops grow quickly, but often with less mineral density than before. Several comparative studies suggest significant declines in nutrients in some vegetables over the decades. That creates a dangerous cycle: exhausted soils, exhausted food, exhausted bodies, greater dependence on supplements. This plant breaks that cycle because it thrives exactly where others fail. Its root can explore deeper layers of the soil and concentrate minerals that many commercial vegetables cannot reach. In cities, that makes it even more interesting. It colonizes construction sites, disturbed lots, sidewalk edges, and compacted areas. Where others see abandonment, it sees opportunity. That's why many urban foragers have started rediscovering it. In community gardens, in neighborhoods with migrant traditions, and on foraging tours, more and more people are identifying it, cooking it, and wondering how it was possible to ignore it for so long. The same is happening in Europe. In Poland, Germany, Greece, and other regions, memories of its culinary use persist. The knowledge never completely disappeared, it just became disconnected from the dominant discourse. And when times get tough, this plant reappears. During periods of famine and war, many families survived thanks to what grew without permission. In occupied Europe during World War II, when supply chains collapsed and traditional crops became scarce, this plant again fed those who still knew how to recognize it. During economic crises in rural areas of America, it was also part of the food for those who couldn't afford to waste a free source of leafy greens. In ancient agricultural texts from Asia, it appears as a backup resource when other crops failed. Again and again, when everything else was lacking, it was still there. The lesson is profound. Resilience doesn't always come from complex systems. Sometimes it comes from simple, free, persistent plants that don't depend on factories, fuel, or global chains. Our ancestors understood that better than us. They maintained a relationship with wild plants because they knew stability isn't guaranteed. We traded that resilience for the convenience of plastic-wrapped vegetables, shipped from far away, and mass-produced supplements. But it only takes one serious disruption to remember how fragile that model is. When transportation, energy, or supplies fail, the value of a resilient plant completely changes. The good news is that recovering it isn't complicated. Identifying it is easier than it seems. Look for young leaves with a whitish film, as if someone had sprinkled flour on their surface. The leaves are usually triangular or diamond-shaped, about 3 to 7 centimeters on mature plants. The edges have irregular teeth. On top, the leaves look somewhat waxy, and that powder washes off. Later, the plant forms dense clusters of small green flowers. Similar species exist. Some people confuse it with other quilites from the same environment, but that resemblance rarely poses a serious risk because several of those plants are also edible. Still, as with any wild plant, it's wise to double-check identification before consuming it. Cultivating it is almost not necessary. Many times it appears on its own in gardens and allotments. The first secret is to stop pulling it up. If you want to establish an area intentionally, simply scatter seeds on disturbed soil in spring after the last frost and water enough until it's established. Then the plant does almost all the rest. Young leaves can be harvested when the plant is between 15 and 20 centimeters tall, which is when they are most tender. If you keep cutting the top growth, it will continue to produce new shoots. Tender stems can be eaten raw in salads with a mild mineral, spinach-like flavor. More developed leaves are best cooked, sautéed with garlic, added to soups, incorporated into tortillas, or mixed into stews. The flower buds and young flowers can also be cooked. If you want to use the seeds, wait until late summer or fall when the seed heads darken and dry. You can strip them into a container, separate the chaff with a gentle air current, and then lightly toast them. You can also grind them into flour or cook them as rustic porridges or atolls. There's an important note about preparation. Like spinach and other leafy greens, this plant contains oxalates. For most people, this isn't a major problem. But if you have a history of kidney stones or frequently consume large quantities, a brief blanching helps reduce them. Just pour boiling water over the leaves, leave them for 2 minutes, and drain. Some of the oxalates will go out with the water. Dried seeds can be stored for years in airtight containers. And here the topic stops being culinary and becomes something much bigger. Food security. Think about what it really means to depend on a supermarket. Shelves can empty in a few hours during an emergency. The chain that brings food to your table depends on fuel, roads, electricity, refrigeration, political stability, and coordinated labor. On average, many meals travel thousands of kilometers before reaching your plate. Every link can fail. Now imagine another model, food that returns on its own, nutrition that doesn't require constant purchases, seeds that wait decades underground, harvests that regenerate in a few days after cutting. That's not fantasy. It's a reality this plant has represented for centuries. Climate change makes this conversation even more urgent. Droughts are intensifying. Heat waves punish conventional crops. Irrigation water costs more. Soils are degrading, and precisely under these conditions, this plant shows its strength: heat tolerance, drought resistance, and the ability to grow in poor soils. While many delicate crops collapse, it keeps appearing. Therefore, the real question isn't whether you should plant it. Many times it's already trying to grow near you. The question is whether you'll know how to recognize it when it appears, if you'll see food or just a weed. Over 3,000 years ago, people in Europe were already eating it as part of their diet. About 5,000 years ago, indigenous peoples of America domesticated its relatives and made them staples of their diet. That knowledge never completely died out. Grandmothers in India still cook batua in winter. In Himalayan communities, they continue to gather it. In Mexico, it still lives on in the tradition of quelites. The wisdom survived in many places, except where industrial agriculture and the supplement market took over the entire scene. And there's another detail that deserves attention. This plant not only offers nutritious leaves, it also brings back an idea we've lost, that the boundary between a crop and a weed is often a cultural decision, not a biological one. For centuries, entire communities knew how to distinguish between the useless and the valuable by observing the behavior of plants, not by repeating commercial labels. When a species nourishes, resists, adapts, and returns year after year, we're not facing a worthless intruder, we're facing a forgotten ally. The problem isn't that it grows too much. The problem is that we stop knowing how to look at it. The industry won't tell you much about a free plant. It can't turn something that comes back on its own and doesn't need packaging to prove its value into a business. But the seeds are still there under your feet, waiting for light, space, and an opportunity. Maybe they've been in the ground for decades. The question is whether you'll be ready to see them differently when they finally sprout. If this story has changed the way you see the plants growing in your garden, subscribe and like this video. We are unearthing the history they tried to hide. It's time to sow the future. Nature's next treasure will be revealed very soon.